So on our panel, we have Matt Scarborough, co-founder and CEO of Bridgeforce, Laura Loomis-Ramon, partner at Jenner & Block, Ashwin Vasan. Did I get that right? Nice. Okay. Close enough. From FS Vector. And then our moderator is Vince Wilson, regulatory counsel at Lead Bank. Come on up, guys. Let's give them a round of applause.
Good afternoon. I'm Vince Wilson, regulatory counsel at Lead Bank. I think we're going to just go down and start with Ashwin and just really quickly.
Intros?
Yeah, intros.
Hi, everyone. Ashwin Vasan. I'm a partner at FS Vector. The sign says that I was the former associate director of research, monitoring, and regulations at the CFPB, which is true when I signed up for this conference. And since then, I joined FS Vector full-time.
Hi, everyone. Laurel Ramon. I'm a partner with Jenner & Block in D.C. I've been in private practice coming up on 7 years. Prior to that, I spent about 17 years as a prosecutor at DOJ, mostly doing financial crimes and money laundering. I spent 3 years at the CFPB, where I overlapped with Ashwin, although I was in enforcement. And then I've been in private practice since then.
And hi, I'm Matt Scarborough. I'm CEO of Bridgeforce Data Solutions. So I come more from a mix of sort of the business and tech background. And, before this, spent also a lot of time in consulting on various regulatory things. So certainly won't have the policy background you guys do, but hit familiarity and hit it from a little different angle.
Thank you all. This is a fantastic panel. We'll be talking about the regulatory landscape behind complaints. And just to make everybody a little more nervous in the room, I'm just going to go through some of the numbers that are posted on the CFPB's website. They are one of the main databases for collecting consumer complaints. Their database goes back to 2012, and since its inception, the CFPB has fielded 6.3 million complaints from consumers. This year to date, there have been 1.8 million complaints. The prior year, there were 1.2 million complaints, which means since 2012, end of this year, more than half of the complaints the CFPB have received have been in these last 2 years. This is a space and an area that regulators are paying particular attention to, something that we should all be paying plenty of attention to. And we're here to discuss what that regulatory landscape looks like, how regulators are looking at these complaints, how they're using them, and what they're expecting us as banks and fintechs to do about it. So with that in mind, opening up to the panel, can we just get an idea from the panel on some of the context around how regulators are handling complaints and your understanding of how that process has evolved over the last 15 years?
Yeah, I can start. Actually, I spent 2 stints at the CFPB most recently, but I was there from 2011 to 16. My very first job there was standing up the CFPB complaint portal with a number of the teammates that were there on the ground. And I remember July 21st, 2011, we all stared, this is a startup moment, stared at the screen and watched that first complaint come in. It was quite memorable, and just hearing you rattle off those numbers is something. For those of you who aren't acquainted with the CFPB complaint process, consumer files complaint, the CFPB forwards it to the financial institution or non-bank, as it were. The institution has a chance to respond, has several options and how they respond, and then it comes back to the consumer. The CFPB then aggregates that data and has a very helpful public database out there. Why does this exist? Well, because a lot of times companies do not give consumers the proper response, and not surprisingly, for many issues, when the consumer complains to the regulators, it gets an escalated response and a more serious approach to relief. So those are the kind of the basics of the system, and I think we'll dive into it, at least from the CFPB perspective, how that system has evolved, but also, just as we've been talking about like internal complaint monitoring, I think the CFPB has probably taken steps over the years to sort of evolve its own approach to sort of looking at those complaints and building policy and enforcement strategies off of them.
Yeah, and to add a little more color, I was there at the same time, but in a different part of the office. I was in the enforcement office. And back then, and I don't believe they do it now, we would be assigned a week, a period of time to go over and work in the consumer response section, the enforcement attorneys. If that sounds scary, it should. And we spent time reviewing the complaints, working with the consumer response office, and doing what the Bureau does, which is mine the database of complaints for potential supervisory and enforcement actions. So it's important to provide us, through the financial institutions to send it on to get a response for the particular consumer, but it's really a huge database of information that the Bureau uses to help define its policies, its enforcement actions, and that sort of thing. And the other thing that I guess I want to mention as we talk about sort of how the Bureau has evolved in its thinking about complaints. I'm not sure this has changed, but it's something I don't know that people always realize. A few years ago, I had an enforcement action involving a pretty large financial institution, and it came with a very large CID and a request for a lot of information, and there was one sort of lead complainant that was being investigated. And interestingly, that complainant had the exact same pretty unusual last name as one of the Bureau enforcement attorneys, turned out to be his son. And so what I always like to say is that CFPB enforcement and every other part of the Bureau are themselves consumers first. And they've always thought from that perspective. They think about their mothers, their fathers, their children, their grandparents, their neighbors, and all of that sort of thing. And that's part of what informs them as they're thinking about these complaints and using the data that comes through this portal.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. Have there been, over these last, you said it was stood up in 2011. What are the changes that have happened in how the CFPB is handling these complaints, digesting them, or how they're using them, in their enforcement?
Yeah, it's an evolution, right? I think that first complaint I mentioned, I will be honest, I don't think we really had a process or a plan on what to do with it at that moment. Much of that evolved organically as the Bureau expanded products. I think there are a couple of evolutions. I think the biggest one was the creation of the public database, which aggregates all the complaints. There was a second wave. Those initial complaints were just published in terms of what the product was and what the issue was. Eventually, the narratives were published as well. And that was actually interesting. I was on the technology side then at the Bureau, and that was an implementation of some basic natural language processing models because the Bureau had to scrub PII from those complaints. If you go onto the Bureau portal now, you'll see kind of XXX with any of the possible PII that could identify that person. That's all done by machine. Surprisingly, if you have 6 million complaints. So you sort of have those kinds of evolutions. And then I would think, and Matt's going to probably talk about this a little bit more, in the last 3 to 4 years, the volume of complaints has exploded, right? I think it took us, 6 or 7 years to reach 1 million. And now from 2011 to now, it's only 13 years. So it's been almost exponential. But there's a reason for that. A lot of it is credit reporting, and there's complexity around that. But in general, I think the reach of the complaint portal, the reach of consumers knowing they have had to do it has gotten greater and greater over time.
Yeah, and I'll add to that from the perspective of a sort of enforcement attorney now on the defense side. I've spent a fair amount of time reviewing CFPB consent orders, looking for their discussion of how they use the complaints and what the complaint data did to lead to whatever the enforcement action is. And for the most part, you really won't find it. And it's interesting because you say, well, how are they using this? And did this complaint data lead to an enforcement action? And I can tell you it does, but you will not see that in any of the CFPB's written enforcement actions, which is interesting. They do publish reports on their complaint data and how they use it and what they make of it. But when it comes to enforcement, there are 2 ways the complaint data is really driving the bus, and that is the database that Ashwin was just talking about, and the ability to use and research that data, and then the data from a financial institution's own database that the CID requires them to produce, and that is a very painful process, and I think we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways to deal with that, but there are really those 2 ways that 2 separate databases of consumer complaint data are involved, and often very much of the time is spent by the Bureau saying, well, wait, we have this complaint. What is your side of the complaint show? And trying to match those up can be very difficult. So I think these are areas that sort of lay the groundwork for where AI can be helpful.
Yeah, and picking up off of both your points, as you mentioned, the consumer reporting issues is at this point by far the single greatest area of complaints through the CFPB. And as you mentioned, they won't publish exactly how this drives their attention, but clearly and rightfully they pay attention to areas that get a lot of complaints. So one of the things we see is changes in that process afterwards of when the CFPB starts looking into consumer reporting and they start asking for all the reporting data, right? And now let's look into those issues. And then, for us, we first put out our data quality scanner to start inspecting those Metro 2 files, help people identify data quality issues in it back in 2015. We've seen the CFPB's approach to evaluating those files evolve significantly in that time, particularly over the last couple years, where we can really see clearly evidenced by the sorts of questions they're asking and the way they come back that they're clearly digesting this in a comprehensive way that they weren't prior to a couple years ago, right? They were, I think, probably doing their best with various manual tools, but now you can see the effects of a very comprehensive view of all the furnishing data, and then I think very easy to follow those tea leaves as they'll start getting more comprehensive views of all the disputes data, all these pieces, trying to drive that through.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. What do you all see as kind of the main challenges that are faced with by financial institutions as they're handling these complaints and as they're trying to do that with an eye towards what the regulators are looking at? And kind of the corollary, what is it that, are there particular areas that the regulators are focusing in on that you would expect, fintechs and banks to pay special attention to?
First is if you get I think most people know this, right? If you get a regulatory complaint, you probably take it very seriously. You respond to it very seriously. Obviously you don't want to create precedent on extensive relief, but that's something to consider. But if you were to sort of want to put yourself in the shoes of how, at least I saw some of the data at the Bureau, I think there are a few things. First, just on the public database, you can kind of slice and dice by product, by entity. Look for spikes, right? Look for trend lines that just don't make sense. Products or your institution that's maybe going up 20, 30%, you would know this, but especially if none of your peers are doing it, that's putting you immediately at risk. That's some sort of standard analytics that I think Bureau staff go through on an ongoing basis and share it with enforcement. And then the second is, of course, you're seeing these complaints, to Laurel's point, see if there are trends in there, right? A part of a compliance management system is complaint handling that is responsive to those trends and does kind of root cause analysis. And other speakers have talked about how kind of AI can help there, but obviously, if there's an underlying UDAP or an underlying risk to consumers that a lot of people are complaining and coming through on, being responsive to that is half of it, and figuring out what the problem is so you can fix it before you have an engagement from an exam or an enforcement action.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I've got them on my phone here, so I'm not checking my email. But I did want to think about, from working with the clients that we work with, what are the things that we see the Bureau and other regulators focusing on the most? And these also happen to be, I think, the areas where AI could be really useful. And number one, I think about distinguishing between complaints and other types of feedback, which is really hard to do. And a lot of companies spend a lot of time trying to do that on the front end with drop-down boxes and other things, but it's still hard to do, and it's hard to separate those out. And number two, categorizing complaints so that the data is useful later, which kind of goes with number one a little bit. And it's hard to do that too, because you don't know exactly what categories might be useful 3 years from now when the Bureau comes knocking and says, give me this information. But that's another area that's just a really big challenge. The third one I was thinking of was and this is an outgoing aspect, and that is to provide consumers with customized, real responses that don't lead to greater frustration and confusion. And that's the kind of thing the Bureau is really thinking about. And some of you may be aware, in the digital currency space, New York has recently issued some guidance on consumer protection and talking about customer complaint handling, and talking about things like having a real person at the end of the line, what hours are available, things that I really think of as sort of speaking the quiet part out loud in terms of what all the regulators are looking for. So that's just an interesting reference. And then finally, responding if you have to, which nobody wants to, but it'll come one day or another, responding to a government inquiry and being able to distill that data. And I can tell you, even the most, sophisticated financial institutions struggle with this hugely. The startups may be no worse off than some of those are. They may be using multiple databases of entities that have been acquired over the years. So there's all kinds of challenges with this. And so it's an area I hope we can find some solutions, because it's painful for everyone when that time comes.
Yeah, I'm actually going to pick up off your last point, right? Kind of anticipating that of when you're going to get asked, ultimately, you're going to get asked to provide these things, whether as part of, hopefully not enforcement, but at least as part of supervision, and getting ahead of that so that you understand your data and what's going on in it and why really well. And AI can be helpful with this, and complaints can help point you at some things, right? So when I think about the world I know best, the credit bureau reporting and disputes, there's a lot of signal. There's also a lot of junky noise, right? There's plenty of complaints that, let's just say, have no obvious connection to any real data issue. There's plenty of disputes that have no obvious connection to any real data issue. That said, there's plenty that do. And I think often financial institutions want to be able to rightfully make the argument back that says, hey, a lot of this isn't as a result of anything I've done wrong. This is just a consumer trying to leverage the system to their own gain. And that will exist, but so does all of the above. And the tighter you can understand the data and what's going on and be able to take each use case and be able to lay that out and meet the regulator and share it, the better. And picking up off of this, one good bit of news relating to the use of AI here too is when you're talking about these tightly regulated areas, most of the various FIs, whether they're talking banks, credit unions, fintechs, they've generally gone to a lot of effort to create really good desktop procedures for some of these highly regulated areas, like handling a credit bureau dispute. Those desktop procedures are hugely valuable for training a generative AI tool, right? When you start to go ahead and you're sucking in all this enormous amount of data, and then you can help leverage the Gen AI to say, hey, there's issues here, essentially, but what do I really do? Well, those same procedures that are helpful for training your human colleagues are really helpful in training a Gen AI agent. So, that's, for me, one of the reasons that, from a techie perspective, the compliance world is a great spot to start with a lot of these tools.
And Vince, can I add one thing? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
We were talking a second ago about how the Bureau has evolved in its thinking about complaints. And one of the things that's sort of obvious, I suppose, but I think the expectations are higher, that the kind of things that you're talking about that the financial institution can do at this point in time. And the Bureau staff are more sophisticated, and they're more comfortable with it themselves. So those expectations are higher. An earlier panel was also talking about, where are the areas where you can try AI that's less risky from a regulatory point of view. And this just strikes me as another one that is in that sense, because it's really a tool. It's an aid. Someone used the metaphor of your coworker next to you, and this is one where the risk is low as long as you're doing some other things to make sure you're capturing everything, but you're not producing the output necessarily to the Bureau directly as proof of any one fact. You're just distilling the information to make it more accessible.
I was just going to pick up on the credit reporting piece, because as Matt mentioned, I mentioned earlier, at least recently, I think 80% of the complaints to the CFPB are about credit reporting, and if not 95% of them are about the 3 national credit reporting agencies. And of that, I think half are about inaccurate information. And of that, to Matt's point, a lot of them are consumers kind of gone through the dispute process, escalating to a complaint, and probably have a record that they don't like, but there's a plenty that actually have inaccurate information still, and it's a cautionary tale for how financial institutions would use technology to handle that consumer interaction of complaints. Because in 2021, and this is before ChatGPT, the Bureau, we noticed that the response rates from the big three to consumers had fallen dramatically. And what was happening there was that consumers were, well, there are two sides to the story, but the big three argued that consumers were working with third parties to submit complaints in a rapid form. And the Bureau was seeing that consumers, when their complaints were being filed with the CFPB, were getting back essentially form letters that said, well, look, the language of your complaint looks like the language of 25 other complaints. Therefore, we're assuming it's not really you, that it's someone doing it on your behalf. And so the relief rates for consumers went down dramatically. What had happened there at the big three was actually a technology investment, an operational investment to reduce cost. They're seeing all these disputes coming in, and they said, well, look, a lot of them we can sort of kick out by just saying it's a form letter, it doesn't count. I may not be getting the legal framework exactly right, but that was essentially kind of what was happening. And then finally, the Bureau kind of said, no, it doesn't work in this circumstance, right? You have to be specific. You have to be tailored to that consumer's needs. You have to actually kind of, if it were a human, we understand machines do some of this processing, but if it were a human, it has to actually kind of review the complaint and respond to it in the right way. And I think Bureau called that out in a public report. Actually, in 12 months, all three national credit reporting agencies started responding with more relief to consumer complaints. And that was all, again, pre-ChatGPT, right? So, Laurel, you're right. Like, using LLM models on your internal complaints to analyze it for trends, pretty safe, right? I mean, using LLMs to respond to consumers on their disputes or regulatory complaints, that's something that, remember, if a consumer is reaching out as a dispute or a regulatory complaint, they've probably already gone pretty crazy with customer service and form responses. So it does demand a very tailored, human response. Doesn't mean you can't co-pilot with an LLM, but it's something to be quite cautious about. And that story with the credit reporting agencies is something that is a cautionary tale. It was just 3 years ago, right? And there's a big switch.
Just my commentary, take it for what it's worth. My sense is that there is a gap, though, in the Bureau, and probably every one of us who's a consumer out there has some frustration with the form letters we receive as customer response. So I think there's a fair amount of room to play with, even though I think that is the more dangerous part in terms of responding directly to a consumer. There's a lot of room for improvement. And so you might be able to play in that gap and get at least better than what people think.
And the technology enables that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of devil in the details, and the technology can enable it, right? And so, because to pick up on your point, very familiar, read through what you guys out of the Bureau put together there, and knowing some of the work that we do, right? It was a classic example, in my view, of I can understand why the CRAs felt the way they did, but then they painted with way too broad of a brush, right? And so, by leveraging these tools and digging into the granularity, they could find the cases that were really the way they're saying, and then help deal with the others. Because it is a challenge to get the signal out of the noise, right? But then, to your point, I think it's also important when looking at AI tools, or any tool, but particularly with AI tools, the standard against which we're held is not perfection, right? It's against a reasonable standard of some sort. So if we can do better than you can today, and it's one use case at a time, if there are millions of credit bureau disputes every month, right? There's complaints have grown a lot. There's a lot more disputes than there are complaints. And so, even if you're taking one use case at a time and you're managing to carve off a percent, tenths of a percent, a few percent at a time, where, hey, we can do this better than the current process, that's a big win, right? This will not come in one giant fell swoop, but there's a lot of iterative opportunity that can add up.
I love that iterative opportunity. I love taking that approach. Do you think that's something that would be useful with the regulators to say, hey, yes, we are using AI, and they may be wary about it, questionable about the process and how it functions, and can we use that argument of iterative improvement with the regulators? Do you think that would be something that is persuasive to them?
I have a thought on this, and no offense to any former regulators among us, myself included, but where there's a gap of knowledge or understanding or practice in general, my sense is, and maybe this is a compliment to the regulators, that they will they will be open to and accepting of a reasonable approach where there's an absence of how to do it, and you tell them how you're going to do it, and it's reasonable, and it doesn't look like it's trying to take advantage of consumers. They will be open. And so the iterative aspect, the other sort of tenet I always rely on is they just want to see there's a plan. A 3-month plan, a 6-month plan, a 1-year plan, but not like, oh, we just threw spaghetti on the wall and we're going to see if it happens. So I think, yes, that you can, but again, like everything, and we heard this earlier, is, communication relationship with your regulator.
And I'd say when people innovating on these things, among my friends and clients that have been around the industry for a while, where folks would run into trouble with regulators doing new things with AI tended to be less about what they were trying to do and more about the fact their monitoring of it wasn't good enough, right? And so I really think about it in the same, and maybe my own bias, I've been a data guy for a long time. I look at the model governance rules that evolved over decades, got formalized, pretty well by 10 or 15 years ago. And so if I take the concepts of model governance and apply it to any of this, right, and anything we're doing around the Gen AI or any sorts of AI, of how you develop it, how you monitor it, take that framework, and in my experience, that if you take that to a regulator or anybody else and go, here's what we think is a really good precedent, we're applying the framework in this way, we're monitoring this thoughtfully, they might have feedback, but I've never had anybody, not embrace that decently well.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in the supervisory context, I mean, if you're going through context matters, right? So, I mean, if you're going through a standard, compliance management system review, and you want to sit down with the examiner and talk to them and compare your sort of A/B testing before and after introducing a new product and how it's creates efficiency without losing accuracy and allows you to be more discerning and finding problems, like, absolutely. I mean, why not? If you know very well that they're there because there was a sudden spike in the last quarter in a certain category of complaints, and you in Reg E, for example, and you have a Reg E scoped exam, like, I'm not sure that's the moment to pull out your new technology, right?
That's a really good point.
So I think it just sort of depends on the context and sort of how you're building long-term trust with the examiners and that conversation you're having with them.
No, that's fantastic. And I love the, having the plan, understanding the right time to implement it, the right time to roll something out. Kind of in that vein, what do you see as the important things to take under consideration when, someone's considering adopting AI? What should be part of that plan or that roadmap that you have to make sure that the regulators understand you have the guardrails in place, or you understand what's going on behind the scenes? And I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit off script here with you guys. So
to go with the theme, I have a thought, and mine is regulators are super focused on staffing right now. I mean, and that's every consent order, every enforcement action is you don't have enough compliance staff, and so they're going to be skeptical if you're trying to solve problems for efficiency, of that argument, that they're going to think maybe you're just trying to do less with less staff. And so you just have to be aware of that in the back of your mind, which means you have to really do the groundwork, which is a staffing analysis on some level, and how the AI tool, and other panelists earlier today have talked about this, pick a narrow problem to solve, don't try to do too much with it, be able to identify it to the regulator and explain why it supplements or supplants the need for certain specific staff, not just generally we're doing this so we need less staff, but what problem is it solving and which roles does it make easier or require fewer staff? That's my first thought.
And this is honestly something where I see a alignment between your comments of what you need to keep regulators happy and, candidly, what you need to have good materials to do an a generative development project, right? When you start trying to get in and train these tools to efficiently answer real questions, right? It's really easy to play with an LLM and get it to show stuff that kind of looks cool, right? No problem. But to get it to solve real business problems with the speed and reliability that you need, you got to get very specific, right? And so having that specificity of your desktop procedures, exactly the use cases you're going for, and understanding very well the data you're feeding into it, this is critical to being able to take a concept and make it truly useful. That same specificity is what enables you to then have that conversation to share with the regulators. Here's exactly the problem we're trying to solve with this, where we can enable through technology a more robust and comprehensive output than a human being can realistically do. And look how we measure it, right? And it can do better than the human being here. And so if I have that framework, and pick your risk tolerance, right? Do you want to say my AI tool has to be better than, the median human agent? How about the 75th percentile, the 90th percentile? That can be one organization to the next, right? But you've got the framework, you can show it, and then you can show, yeah, I'm getting efficiencies too. It's not just an efficiency play.
Yeah, and I think as you're sort of demonstrating technologies, right, that having a clear sense of those like true public policy outcomes also matters. So if you kind of go back to, that the story of the credit reporting agencies, like I can totally see that at some level someone was like, the metric is speed to resolve the dispute, right? And I can totally imagine that an examiner at one point told them that was the metric, right? And so like, you come up with an automated system to quickly deny all disputes, you sort of miss the point when the metric that is how many consumers get relief then plummets, right? And then someone eventually figures that out, whether it's the regulator directly or advocates that then are looking at the database, talking to regulators. So, some of this is also thinking about what those, metrics are and maybe communicating a little bit in terms of like, it's not just the efficiency saving, it's actually we're finding more of those kind of needles in the haystack or the signal from the noise that really gets the right consumers with the right problems, the relief they need in a quick way. And then it's a much more compelling story than saying, we're complying with our own procedural requirements for timelines at a higher rate. I mean, that's great and might work for a while, but I think if you're deteriorating the customer service in the back end, it's not going to work forever.
Yeah, I think that's really worth emphasizing. That's a really good point. I mean, think about the public policy is a really good way to think about it. I mean, one thing when I'm talking about consumer protection matters that I always think about is the Bureau looks at a platform, an app, an interaction from the consumer's point of view. And most of the companies that I work with look at the back end view. They've got this, we've got this piece in, we've got that piece in, everything's compliant. This piece is compliant with this reg, this is compliant with this law, we're good. The Bureau does not do that. And they've put guidance on their website talking about this. They look at what what is the consumer's experience? And again, they're thinking of their grandmother or whoever. And so if you think about those public policy imperatives and what is it you're doing and will it aid those, you're going to be in a better position. That's a good point.
No, I love that idea. The number one, the way that the regulators look at it, but then saying, okay, let's look at that function right now. Where are we right now? How is AI going to improve that? Having the numbers and the metrics to be able to say, this is where we were a year ago. We adopted this. This is how we're using it, and this is where we're at now. And it's fantastic.
We can take questions if people had questions.
Yeah.
10 minutes, yeah.
We have any questions? Opening up to the group.
Oh, everybody doesn't need to turn around. Let's make it up. Okay. Can y'all talk about dark patterns and what that means and how this comes up in the context that you're talking about, ways to detect that, avoid it? Sounds like a cool term, but it's still very confusing to me. So.
You're freshest to
Yeah, is Ann still here? No, I'm kidding. Dark patterns. I mean, I don't know what the definition is. It is the moment when you grab the monitor and shake it. You're probably facing a dark pattern. I think we've all experienced this, trying to unsubscribe something, trying to find a terms and conditions. Just recently, I was like, until you do things like this, I wanted to look at the APR on some of my credit cards, and I forgot how challenging that is and how not obvious it is in a digital in a digital interface, you have to click into the statement and scroll down to the last page, and there's the price of the product. Like, I mean, it's, no other very few products function like that otherwise. And so, I think it's any kind of is in a highly kind of, most of our products in financial service today are largely delivered digitally. Digital engagement, digital design affords creative people a lot of ways to obscure the fundamental costs and benefits of a product. Typically not the benefits, but definitely the costs. They obscure consumers' ability to sort of take control or whether they want to have the product or not. And any of those things, whether they're font sizes or hard to find customer service numbers, can reach this kind of colloquial term of a dark pattern. At least that's how I see it. Legally that translates into a UDAP, but I hand it over to Laurel.
Well, and I'm a little bit cynical as much as I am a fan of the Bureau. I mean, to me, the term dark patterns is just a repackaging of things the Bureau has been working on all along and the FTC before. It's not something new, but it is like the example you brought up, talking about sort of subscription fees you can't get out of or something like that. And where AI and what we've been talking about in sort of complaints analysis comes in is that oftentimes you have consumers calling in and they aren't necessarily complaining, but they're expressing confusion about something. And oftentimes, again, that doesn't end up being categorized as a complaint, but it actually is really, really relevant information. And if you're sensitive enough to that, you might pick up on the kind of things that the Bureau thinks are dark patterns.
No, that's a fantastic point. Being very aware of what's going on that may or may not be a complaint and how you can head that off. I like that. Are there any other questions? Sorry, I have poor eyesight and the lights don't help me out at all.
Thanks. So one of my staff received this from a field examiner on the topic of complaints, and that sort of goes to what I think, Laurel, you brought up about a complaint versus just a general inquiry or confusion type situation. So, and this is sort of like what my analyst was speaking to the examiner paraphrased. So the examiner told my analyst that, hey, you need to, any inquiry, including hey, reset my password or how do I log into this site, needs to be logged as a complaint. And they also said, and this is very important, that this product is not having enough complaints. So is there a complaint bogey, first of all, that we're supposed to hit for different types of complaints? And I know that the regulatory agencies have bogeys for different types of product, like, hey, this is the yardstick for SARS, this is the yardstick for complaints. And also, is the examiner correct in that how do I reset my password should be a complaint? Thank you.
That's going a little far. I mean, the Bureau does not have a definition of complaint itself. I've looked. It doesn't exist. It's not in the exam manual. It's not in any reg. It's not in any piece of guidance. So again, you're better off, and I'm sure every financial institution here has this, but I've run across some that don't, which is, no policy that defines for that financial institution what is or is not a complaint. So you would very typically see technical inquiries like I lost my password being defined out of what a complaint is. But I do think there is a gray area. I think the Bureau expects the definition of complaint to be broader rather than narrow. And the case that I mentioned before that involved a large financial institution, it was an issue of a UDAP, a deception claim, because there was a suggestion that so many customers were calling in expressing confusion about how something worked that it was deceptive. And so you want your sort of filter to be broad enough, and this again may be where AI can help, is that you maybe have several layers of scrubbing of complaints so that you pick up on some of these grayer areas. But I would take issue with the idea that a call in for a password is a complaint.
Yeah, I would too. And I've looked too, and I don't think there is a definition of complaint, and maybe that makes sense at some level because every institution has its own risk profile, and I know it's starting to sound like third-party risk management guidance here, but you want to calibrate your system to that, what your product mix is and your consumers are. I would just building on what you said, I mean, the more I think about it, right, you want to think of your complaint system as an intelligence system as well as a servicing thing, right? So the servicing piece is consumers are calling, they're complaining, they're frustrated. Yeah, you have your normal consumer metrics, NPS, whatever. You want to make sure they're happy. Any good company would want to do that. The intelligence piece is, are you using it in a smart way, not just for compliance with the law, but to evolve your product overall? And to Laurel's point, yeah, you want to highlight regulatory violations, but there might be things that are confusing, that are on the cusp of a regulatory violation. And so, that's where this, AI solutions offer huge potential, right? To sort of get through that unstructured data at much greater speed and iterate on that kind of feedback loop from complaints to product, compliance and product, so.
I would just add really quickly, if you have a product that doesn't have complaints, be very afraid. If you have a fintech that's telling you they don't have complaints and you're in a bank oversight like we do at Lead, be very afraid. There should be complaints.
Yes, lots of complaints, for sure. So the credit reporting category obviously is the number one big volume category at the CFPB. I would challenge the assumption that the customers are actually going to furnishers first. I don't think they are. I think they're going straight to the bureaus, or they're going straight to the CFPB just because they think that's going to get them attention. And I would also say that I would bet the vast majority of those are frivolous and irrelevant, which is, I think, what you were alluding to earlier. So I think the question is, are you aware of the Bureau doing anything in terms of their technology and analysis to see this as a problem that is just basically a lot of consumers, quite frankly, gaming the system to get trade lines deleted?
Yeah, this was, I'm not sure of anything specific they did. It was kind of an ongoing conversation with the trade association when I was there. Again, some of the furnishing data was not available to the Bureau, right? So you can only see that someone complained, but you could look at the complaint and say, well, the language of this complaint matches 100 others and nudge. But I think in the end, I might be wrong, but I think the Bureau still forwarded those on and put the burden primarily on the NCRAs, who then, of course, if it's a furnishing issue, can hand it off and work through their furnishers. So by and large, I think I agree. When the numbers are striking, 6.1 million, but there's definitely an acceleration of awareness that the Bureau can solve your problems, combined with third parties, marketing services to consumers to do this for them, along with handling the underlying dispute. And so that the noise in that has increased for sure. The magnitude of the noise was a source of much debate, but it has increased for sure.
Yeah, and I think if you think about a Venn diagram of the credit bureau dispute that is somebody that has done absolutely nothing wrong, they own the account, and there's just there's a screw up in what's on their credit report, then there's that population, right? It's small, it exists. When you look at the population that is just trying to get out from under a debt, there's that population. There's also this big overlap of where they do legitimately own the debt and there's data issues on there. And I'll make the analogy, we've all been in meetings where somebody's coming in, they're making a really valid point, but in their presentation they have 5 bullet points. 4 of them are rock solid. One was kind of squishy. And the one that was kind of squishy becomes the subject of the whole meeting, right? There's quite a lot of trade lines and disputes that do have at least some sort of a data issue on them. And it's the equivalent, what happens there, a couple things. One, it becomes the equivalent of that sort of, not very strong point in the meeting that becomes a distraction. The other thing, and I'll tell you, I can clearly see this in the data, it attracts the credit repair organizations. Quite clearly, the automated tools that those organizations use don't appear to be overly sophisticated, but there's certainly some data conditions I can see that are a magnet for them to go, oh, it makes it way easier for us to dispute it when there is at least something there that's messed up. right? So the cleaner the data is, we do see that make an impact on the disputes later. There's still plenty out there, certainly a majority. More than 50% I cannot in any way see related to a data issue, but the ones related to the data issue are a much bigger minority than I think most furnishers intuitively think.
All right, I apologize, but I think we're out of time right now. Thank you all so much. Ashwin, Laurel, Matt, thank you for being here.
For them. Thank you.